And they were like really quite fierce, shouting at me.
Yeah.
And they locked me up in a cell for 7 hours.
For years, David Walliams looked untouchable. He was the best-selling children's author whose books filled classrooms across Britain, and the charismatic judge who became one of the biggest stars on Britain's Got Talent. Then, everything changed. One private conversation was secretly recorded. Leaked comments exploded across headlines. Old allegations resurfaced. Even the empire that had made him one of Britain's most successful children's authors suddenly faced questions no one had been asking before. How does someone go from being one of Britain's most beloved entertainers to facing controversy after controversy? Today, we are uncovering what really happened to David Walliams, the scandals that shook his career, and why one of British entertainment's biggest names has never looked quite the same since. The leak that shocked Britain. Black Lives Matter protests spreading across the world in June of 2020 triggered a sweeping reassessment of television, film, and comedy that had long been accepted without widespread challenge. Programs that once reflected mainstream entertainment suddenly faced renewed examination through a very different cultural lens, and Little Britain quickly became one of the highest-profile examples of that shift. Within days, Netflix, BBC iPlayer, and BritBox all removed the series from their streaming libraries, explaining that certain material no longer aligned with contemporary editorial standards. For a show that had once dominated British comedy and attracted audiences approaching 10 million viewers, the removals marked a dramatic reversal in how its legacy was being viewed. The greatest criticism centered on characters involving racial impersonation. David Walliams's portrayal of Desiree de Vere, performed using dark makeup, an afro wig, and exaggerated physical features, became the primary focus, while Matt Lucas also faced criticism for similar portrayals elsewhere in the series. Material that had originally aired with relatively little public backlash was now widely viewed as reinforcing offensive racial stereotypes. Both performers responded with public apologies, acknowledging that portraying people of other races through makeup had been wrong, and expressing regret that the sketches had caused offense. Their statements reflected a broader recognition across British television that standards surrounding representation had changed significantly since the programs first aired. The renewed scrutiny did not stop with race. Critics also revisited Little Britain's portrayals of disabled and transgender characters, arguing that many recurring sketches relied on caricature rather than satire. Advocacy groups and media commentators questioned whether jokes aimed at marginalized communities had been disguised as social commentary, reopening debates that had existed during the original broadcast but had never substantially affected the show's popularity. By 2022, edited versions of selected episodes gradually returned to some streaming services after the most controversial scenes had been removed. The original broadcasts, however, remained largely unavailable on mainstream platforms, leaving one of Britain's most successful comedy series permanently associated with an unresolved debate about changing cultural standards and the longevity of comedy built around shock value. Although the controversy damaged Walliams's reputation, it remained manageable. He apologized, continued writing books, made occasional public appearances, and largely avoided becoming the central focus of the wider debate. Few observers realized that a far more personal controversy had already been set in motion years earlier, hidden inside footage from an entirely different television production. During filming breaks for Britain's Got Talent at London's Palladium Theatre in January 2020, production microphones continued recording conversations between members of the judging panel after filming had paused. Believing they were speaking privately, the judges continued chatting between takes while audio equipment remained active. Those recordings stayed unnoticed outside the production team for more than 2 years. Everything changed in November 2022 when transcripts obtained by The Guardian were published. The newspaper reported that Walliams had made crude and insulting remarks about at least 2 contestants during filming breaks. One contestant was reportedly described using a derogatory insult after repeatedly making sexual comments during an audition, while another female contestant was the subject of explicit sexual remarks once she had left the stage. The publication of those transcripts immediately transformed what had been private off-camera conversations into a national news story. The reaction was swift. Walliams issued a public apology almost immediately, stating that the remarks had been private conversations shared with friends, never intended for public release. He acknowledged that the language had been disrespectful and accepted full responsibility, expressing regret for the comments regardless of the circumstances in which they had been made. Fremantle, the production company behind Britain's Got Talent, also condemned the remarks, describing the language as inappropriate and inconsistent with the values expected on the program. ITV likewise distanced itself from the comments as pressure mounted over Walliams's future on one of Britain's biggest entertainment shows. Within weeks, Walliams's departure from the judging panel was confirmed, bringing an end to a 10-year tenure that had fundamentally reshaped his public image. Since joining the show in 2012, he had become known for balancing Simon Cowell's sharper critiques with warmth, humor, and compassion toward contestants. Memorable moments, comforting nervous performers, and encouraging children had helped establish him as one of the program's most popular personalities. Losing that role represented far more than a routine casting change. It removed one of the country's most visible television platforms from a performer whose reputation had increasingly depended on being viewed as approachable, kind, and family-friendly. Public opinion fractured almost immediately. Many viewers argued that the remarks revealed attitudes fundamentally inconsistent with the caring television personality Walliams had projected for years. Others focused less on the comments themselves and more on the circumstances surrounding their release, questioning why private conversations had continued to be recorded after filming had stopped, and how confidential production material had ultimately reached the press. The controversy, therefore, evolved into 2 separate debates running simultaneously, one concerning Walliams' own conduct, the other concerning privacy, workplace recording practices, and media ethics. Bruno Tonioli was announced as Walliams's replacement shortly afterward, permanently filling the vacant judging seat. His arrival signaled that the program intended to move forward rather than revisit the controversy. For Walliams, however, the consequences were only beginning. What appeared publicly to be a damaging media scandal would soon develop into a high court legal dispute that revealed a far deeper personal and psychological impact than anyone outside his closest circle had previously understood. The empire kept crumbling. Rather than quietly accepting that professional exit, legal action followed against production company Fremantle Media in September of 2023, alleging misuse of private information alongside violations of United Kingdom data protection law. Court filings argued that microphones should never have remained active once official filming had concluded for the day, placing responsibility for the leak squarely on production practices rather than on personal conduct alone. Those same high court documents revealed a far more troubling personal toll than most outside observers had ever assumed existed. Filed claims described serious psychiatric harm connected directly to the leak, including a documented period of self-harm thoughts following the initial wave of media coverage. Additional private conversations reportedly captured by those same live microphones touched on deeply personal subjects entirely unrelated to any contestant at all, including struggles with food addiction, the earlier death of a father, and the ongoing collapse of a marriage that had already ended years earlier in public. A resolution arrived in November of that same year, with Fremantle issuing a formal apology alongside what both sides publicly described as an amicable settlement. Financial terms were never disclosed publicly, though the production company specifically acknowledged the genuine distress caused by the leak, while also praising years of overall contribution to the show's success. That settlement offered a measure of closure after roughly 12 months of public legal battle, though it did surprisingly little to fully repair a reputation still recovering from multiple overlapping controversies landing almost on top of one another. An entirely new and far more damaging chapter, in fact, was already quietly forming behind the scenes, completely out of public view. More than 2 years after the Britain's Got Talent settlement, an entirely separate crisis emerged from inside the publishing world itself. Reports surfaced on December 19, 2025, revealing that HarperCollins UK had permanently ended its entire publishing relationship with Walliams, confirming it would not release any further titles following an internal investigation into workplace conduct that had reportedly concluded a full year earlier, back in 2024. According to detailed reporting from The Telegraph, junior female staff members at the publisher had reportedly raised specific concerns about behavior during private meetings, with some employees allegedly advised never to visit certain locations alone and instructed to work in pairs whenever direct contact with Walliams became unavoidable. One staff member was said to have received a 5-figure financial settlement after formally raising concerns through internal channels, later leaving the company entirely. The decision to finally sever the relationship came only after Charlie Redmayne unexpectedly stepped down as HarperCollins' chief executive in October of that same year, with incoming CEO Kate Elton confirmed in the role shortly afterward and reportedly driving the final decision to part ways once she took over. A public statement issued through representatives firmly denied every single allegation, insisting Walliams had never been informed of any specific allegation or formal investigation, had never been given any opportunity to respond to specific claims, and was actively taking legal advice in response to the publisher's decision. HarperCollins, for its part, repeatedly declined to comment on internal personnel matters beyond confirming the relationship had ended, citing employee well-being and existing internal reporting processes without elaborating any further. This particular controversy has remained noticeably less widely discussed than the earlier Britain's Got Talent scandal, arriving during the busy holiday season and partly overshadowed by an already familiar prior controversy still fresh in public memory. Yet, losing an entire publishing partnership responsible for tens of millions of pounds in lifetime book sales may ultimately prove to be the more financially significant blow of the two combined, regardless of which one generated more headlines at the actual moment it broke. How it all started. David Edward Walliams was born on August 20, 1971, at St. Teresa's Maternity Hospital in Wimbledon, London, to a London transport engineer named Peter and a laboratory technician named Kathleen, who worked at Sutton Grammar School. Childhood unfolded in the quiet Surrey suburb of Banstead, in a residential pocket known as Nork, alongside a younger sister named Julie, inside a household that valued steady, practical work far more than anything resembling show business. Education continued through Collingwood Boys' School in Wallington, and then Reigate Grammar School in Surrey, where a young Walliams shared classrooms with future writer Robert Shearman, long before a Bachelor of Arts in Drama at the University of Bristol between 1989 and 1992 gave real shape to an early creative ambition. During a university holiday in 1990, a summer stint performing with the National Youth Theatre introduced Walliams to a fellow young actor named Matt Lucas, the two of them bonding almost instantly over a shared love of Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer's brand of surreal, grotesque comedy. An unlikely friendship neither one could have known would eventually define an entire era of British television together. Joining the Actors' Union Equity created an unexpected early hurdle, since another performer already held the surname Williams under that same registry. A small adjustment to Walliams solved the registration problem completely, and without anyone realizing it at the time, permanently created the exact stage name that would eventually become a household word across Britain for the next 3 decades. Small television and radio appearances followed through much of the 1990s. Unremarkable work by any measure, including minor sketch roles and a spoof documentary series that gave almost no real indication of the sudden, character-driven fame still waiting only a few years further down the road. Real momentum built slowly rather than arriving overnight. In 1992, talent scout Bob Mortimer spotted Lucas performing a character called Sir Bernard Chumley on the London comedy circuit. And the following year, Walliams and Lucas took that same act to the Edinburgh Festival together, returning with new Chumley material across 2 further Edinburgh runs before eventually building an entire sellout tour throughout 1997. A spoof music industry sketch show called Rock Profile followed on BBC Choice and later BBC Two, directed in its earliest episodes by a young Edgar Wright, giving both performers a genuine creative testing ground for the grotesque, exaggerated characters that would eventually define an entire decade of British comedy. Small film roles arrived around that same period as well. Minor prison scene parts in Plunkett and McLean, and a supporting appearance in a Pet Shop Boys music video, work far too small to build any real career around, but valuable enough to keep both performers visible inside an industry that had not yet decided what to make of either one of them. None of it hinted at the scale of what a BBC Radio Commission was about to unlock only a few years later. The show that changed everything. A radio sketch show launched in 2000 eventually transformed into the BBC television series Little Britain in 2003, built entirely around a rotating cast of exaggerated British characters performed by Walliams and Lucas together, the 2 of them slipping in and out of dozens of different personas across a single half-hour episode. Catchphrases spread through school playgrounds and office break rooms alike almost instantly, turning private jokes shared between 2 comedy partners into a genuine national phenomenon within just a couple of broadcast seasons. Characters including Lou and Andy, Emily Howard, and Marjorie Dawes became instantly recognizable shorthand across the entire country, with nearly 10 million viewers tuning in for individual episodes at the absolute height of that popularity. A follow-up project called Come Fly With Me continued the same character-driven format in 2010, once again drawing massive audiences hungry for more of the exact same exaggerated humor, before Lucas eventually made clear he had no interest in a second series, wanting instead to pursue an entirely different creative direction of his own. Awards and critical attention followed quickly, cementing a reputation as one of the sharpest comedy minds working anywhere in British television during that entire decade. Little Britain claiming the Comedy Programme Prize at the National Television Awards 3 years running. Underneath the wigs and prosthetics, however, sat creative choices that would eventually return as a serious liability decades later, long after the original broadcasts had already faded out of regular rotation entirely. One character in particular, a monstrously exaggerated caricature named Desiree de Vere, quietly waiting to become a genuine reputational landmine. An American adaptation called Little Britain USA followed on HBO in 2008, an attempt to translate distinctly British characters and references for an entirely different audience that never quite matched the original's domestic success, running for only a single short season before quietly disappearing from the schedule. A live stage version toured arenas across the country regardless, proving the underlying characters still carried genuine box office pull well beyond their original television run, an entire second commercial life built on top of an already successful first one. Critics on the American side of that adaptation pointed specifically to cultural references that simply didn't translate. characters built around distinctly British class anxieties, landing flat for audiences who had no context for the jokes underneath the wigs. A mismatch neither performer had fully anticipated going in. A later picture book called Robo-Dog, released well after the Britain's Got Talent departure, found Walliams photographed publicly alongside his young son dressed as the title character, a rare glimpse of ordinary family life deliberately offered to the public at a moment when the rest of his professional reputation was still absorbing serious damage from an entirely different direction. Success on that scale rarely stays simple for long, and off-screen life was already about to become just as eventful as anything happening in front of the cameras. Why everyone loved David Walliams. Charity work became an unexpected second act, running parallel to an already thriving comedy career, starting with a grueling swim across the English Channel in 2006. Later described as a kind of personal redemption, that swim arrived during a period of genuine private struggle connected to a bipolar disorder diagnosis, something only disclosed publicly well after the physical challenge itself had already been completed in full. A far more ambitious swim followed in 2011, covering roughly 140 miles down the entire length of the River Thames for the charity Sport Relief. Exhaustion, infection, and sheer physical strain nearly ended that attempt entirely partway through. Yet, the swim still raised over £1 million and dramatically reshaped public perception away from pure comedy and towards something closer to genuine, hard-earned admiration. A swim along the Zambezi River followed years later, continuing an established pattern of extreme physical challenges undertaken publicly for charitable causes rather than personal glory. Interviews from that same era revealed a far more vulnerable side of a performer best known for over-the-top characters, describing periods of insomnia, self-doubt, and emotional extremes that rarely matched the confident, cheeky public image built through years of primetime television. Beyond the shows themselves, an extensive, ongoing relationship with both comic relief and sport relief continued for years afterward, school visits and telethon appearances becoming a regular fixture of an entire public identity built increasingly around genuine altruism rather than sketch comedy alone. That reputation for real generosity, built deliberately over the better part of a decade, would eventually make everything that came later feel like an even sharper reversal for longtime fans who had come to see the charity work as the truer version of the man behind the wigs and prosthetics. That same willingness toward public vulnerability would eventually resurface in a very different, far more painful context years later, though nobody watching those charity swims at the time could have predicted exactly how that vulnerability would come back around. An invitation to join the judging panel on Britain's Got Talent arrived in 2012, placing Walliams alongside Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, and Alicia Dixon on one of the biggest entertainment programs in the entire country. Playful banter with Cowell quickly became a genuine fan-favorite dynamic, his lively, mischievous energy providing a deliberate contrast against Cowell's colder, more clipped judging persona, and that same chemistry earned Walliams Best Judge honors at the National Television Awards on multiple separate occasions across a decade-long run. Real warmth toward nervous contestants defined some of the single most memorable moments the show ever produced. An audition from the dog act, Ashley and Pudsey, left an entire panel and studio audience completely charmed. Walliams's genuine, obvious adoration for the performing dog adding real delight to an already impressive routine. A routine that eventually went on to win the entire series outright. A young singer named Malachi Paul once broke down in tears mid-audition, overwhelmed by nerves, and Walliams left his seat entirely to comfort the boy directly on stage, encouraging him gently to keep going rather than simply letting the moment collapse. A piece of real, unscripted kindness that stuck with audiences long after that particular season ended. Real comic timing showed up just as reliably. During one particularly memorable audition, a contestant named Aaron delivered a rendition of Let It Go in a voice widely described as genuinely monstrous, prompting Amanda Holden to slam the buzzer in open shock, while Walliams instead joked that the performance was exactly what he imagined the voice inside Simon Cowell's own head sounded like, before still sending the contestant through to the next round anyway. Moments like that built a reputation for someone who understood the show was meant to stay fun rather than purely serious, which made everything that followed feel like even more of a genuine betrayal once it finally came to light. An entirely different kind of story about that same judging panel surfaced in October of 2020, when Amanda Holden and Alicia Dixon discovered a striking pay disparity running underneath the show's cheerful surface the entire time. Holden had reportedly been earning around £700,000 per season, while Dixon earned closer to $450,000, both figures sitting well beneath Walliams' own reported £1.8 million salary for the exact same amount of work. Both women pushed publicly for equal pay once the disparity became known, and Simon Cowell, acting both as fellow judge and the show's executive producer, ultimately agreed to raise their salaries to match, a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. Personal life shifted just as dramatically during those same years on the panel. Walliams and Dutch model Lara Stone had reportedly first met at a Chelsea football match in 2009, an early connection built on a shared, slightly wicked sense of humor rather than any obvious glamour. Stone later recalled feeling genuinely nervous ahead of their first date, texting Walliams afterward simply to thank him for dinner, only for him to reply asking who exactly was texting him, a joke that apparently set the tone for everything that followed. An engagement was announced in January of 2010, followed by a lavish wedding ceremony at Claridge's Hotel in central London that same May. A star-studded guest list, reportedly including Elton John, Russell Brand, and Stephen Fry, among the crowd. Just 4 months later, the couple held a second ceremony at the very same hotel in front of family and friends, an event that alone cost a reported £80,000. Son Alfred arrived on May 6, 2013, later inspiring the dedication inside the best-selling book Bad Dad. That marriage did not last. Divorce proceedings began in September of 2015, citing unreasonable behavior after 5 years together, with Walliams reportedly devastated by the split, even as Stone agreed to accept the blame during proceedings themselves. A decree was finalized only 6 weeks after the initial filing, closing that particular chapter with unusual speed for a relationship that had once been celebrated across countless magazine covers as one of British entertainment's more glamorous unions. Stone has since remarried, meeting her current husband on a dating app in 2018, while Walliams has reportedly turned to a celebrity dating app of his own in search of something similarly lasting. His profile said to feature photographs alongside his 2 border terriers, Bert and Ernie. The boy in the dress arrived in 2008, marking the beginning of an enormously successful second career writing children's fiction almost entirely separate from anything happening on television. Gangsta Granny and Billionaire Boy followed soon after, eventually building a catalog exceeding 60 million copies sold worldwide, spread across translations in more than 50 different languages and encompassing more than 20 novels alongside multiple short story collections and picture books. Several titles made the jump to screen adaptations broadcast during peak holiday viewing slots. Gangsta Granny becoming a 1-hour BBC special in 2013 before a sequel starring Sheridan Smith followed nearly a decade later in 2022, further cementing an image as one of the single most trusted names in British family entertainment. Bookshops built entire dedicated sections around a single living author, an extremely rare feat inside an industry usually dominated by long-established literary names rather than television personalities moonlighting as novelists. Not everyone viewed that success as purely earned talent. Critics inside publishing circles increasingly questioned the broader trend of celebrity-authored children's books, and persistent rumors of uncredited ghostwriting support followed that same catalog for years, without ever fully derailing the commercial success surrounding it. Certain books also drew specific criticism over the years for stereotypical portrayals of particular cultures and characters, an early warning sign of trouble that would resurface again decades later in a far more serious, far more consequential form entirely. For more than a decade, none of that quieter criticism meaningfully slowed sales figures or public affection in any real way. That would eventually change, but not before an entirely separate crisis arrived first, from a completely different direction than anyone in publishing had anticipated. Later titles, including Fing, Mr. Stink, and a first comic book venture called Astro Chimp, kept an entire catalog expanding well past 20 novels, alongside 7 separate short story collections and 10 standalone picture books. A publishing output pace few full-time novelists ever managed to sustain across an entire career, let alone one built alongside a full-time television schedule at the same time. Beyond publishing, film work continued in parallel throughout those same years, supporting roles in the Hollywood comedy Dinner for Schmucks, alongside Paul Rudd and Steve Carell, and in Michael Winterbottom's The Look of Love, giving Walliams brief exposure to American and independent film audiences who had never once encountered Little Britain or Britain's Got Talent at all. What's left of his legacy? Public life has continued in a noticeably reduced form since that entire string of overlapping controversies began landing one after another. Occasional acting work has still surfaced, including a supporting role in the film The Coral, released in late 2025, alongside continued public appearances at events such as the Wimbledon Championships that same year, suggesting a public presence deliberately kept smaller and far more selective than the constant primetime visibility of the previous decade. Ironically, an entirely new generation discovered Little Britain through short clips circulating on TikTok throughout 2025, often stripped completely of any surrounding context from the original broadcasts. Millions of views accumulated across countless short videos, sparking persistent online rumors of a potential full revival, even while the original blackface controversy and the far more recent publishing scandal continued generating negative headlines elsewhere online. No return to Britain's Got Talent has ever been formally discussed by anyone involved, with Bruno Tonioli having filled that now permanent vacancy on the judging panel years earlier. Legal advice regarding the HarperCollins allegations remains ongoing as of the most recent reporting available, with no formal resolution announced publicly on that particular front. Reports place his net worth at roughly $25 million, built across 3 decades of television work, charity swims, and one of the most commercially successful children's book catalogs in the entire country. Wealth that has remained largely intact even as the reputation attached to it has taken repeated, serious damage. Commentators inside the entertainment industry have increasingly framed the two scandals as connected rather than coincidental, arguing that a performer who spent years balancing a provocative, boundary-pushing public persona against a parallel role as the nation's most trusted children's author had always been managing an unusually precarious coalition, one that finally became impossible to sustain once separate allegations from separate parts of an entire career arrived within roughly 2 years of each other. Whether that reputation can ever fully recover remains an open question. Nobody, including Walliams himself, appears able to answer with any real confidence right now. From swimming the length of the Thames to selling 60 million children's books, and from a beloved judging chair to 2 entirely separate scandals arriving years apart from each other, the story of David Walliams shows exactly how quickly decades of goodwill can unravel once hidden footage and private allegations finally reach daylight. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Drop a comment down below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more real stories behind the biggest names in British entertainment.